Hello everybody and welcome to the 11th episode of the Daily Landscape Photography Critique sponsored by K's Filters, and today we're going to be looking at the images of an anonymous photographer. So let's get started. Three really quite different images here, and let's have a look at this photo from what I assume is a public park or perhaps an estate, but obviously a man-made landscape here. And you can tell because it is perfectly beautiful. Of course, these are planted trees and a constructed path with this almost sinusoidal line, really gorgeous curves that even a perfect river couldn't quite replicate. So it really is very, very easy on the eye. With a simple scene like this, though, small mistakes can stand out a little bit, and it's not quite level. So you can see all of the trees are growing to the left. So level, I think, is somewhere here. And I don't know what to say about this in many ways because it is so perfect that there isn't much to critique. The way that the light spreads across the landscape and is broken by the shadows of the trees is lovely, and in the way that it highlights the trees but allows the near foreground to be in shadow, so that our attention, as if there were any doubt, is very clearly on those trees, and that's emphasized by the misty conditions which eliminate the true background here and allow all that separation. So it's hard to see how this photo could be better in many ways, but one small area might be in the edit, because when I saw the thumbnail of both of these photos, I wasn't sure which was the edit and which was the original, because I really quite like the way that the original raw looks from a rendering perspective, from a color and tone perspective. And I really don't think there's too much that needs to be done here. And the reason that I prefer the original, I think, is that it retains that soft atmosphere, whereas the edit is just a little bit contrasty, and so it doesn't feel like morning maybe in the same way. So I think somewhere between the raw and the edit is the sweet spot for me. So I would just add a bit of contrast here and perhaps darken down the foreground ever so slightly with a gradient and a bit of contrast. And just darken down the exposure slightly, something like that. Maybe a tiny bit of vibrance just to get the freshness of the greens cutting through, and we could even try just darkening down ever so slightly just to get a bit more rich color in this sunlit portion of the grass here. And that isn't level, of course, so let's sort that out. And then I think just a little vignette, and we're probably done. Always enable remove chromatic aberration, and yeah, I mean, we don't want to do too much with that vignette, but that does just help to hold the eye in ever so slightly, and we could even play around with a little gradient at the top. Let's just see what that does. I mean, it's just such a perfect scene, this. Really, really gorgeous. I think a slightly more subtle edit will help it on its way. But yeah, very lovely image to start with. So onto this photo that looks like it was taken in the Faroe Islands, but it says Ballydavid Head, so clearly not. There has been a lot of editing to get the image looking this way, and I have to critique that in this case, because I think it hasn't been done quite well enough, and so the image has a degree of it has an artificial quality because the tonal placements don't ring true to me. So we have the shadow of the headland here that actually ends up brighter than some of the tones in the cloud. But I mean, we've got a halo that's quite obviously visible, a very narrow one, but it looks a bit plasticky and flat. And I think that there's just a bit too much work that's gone into the edit here. And I understand the urge, because this shower pouring out of the cloud and all this amazing structure and color, of course, you want to show that in the most impactful way. I would too. But you have to be very careful. You can't have your cake and eat it with many of these scenes, because if you add a lot of contrast into a sky, then you can't reduce the contrast excessively effectively by lifting the shadows without it looking a little bit false. So I think compositionally, I mean, you're looking straight down the line of the cliffs with this enormous shower overhead. It's fairly straightforward and it's very effective. So I think really it is the edit to talk about here. So let's have a quick look at the raw file, and we'll go from here and we'll see what I might end up with very, very quickly. So the white balance is already a little bit warm, so I'll leave that where it is, at least for the time being. And we're just going to add a load of contrast and boost the exposure. And then we see that this shower is sunlit and perhaps a bit too bright. So let's see what this highlight slider does. And that does start to bring in a bit of texture in there. So what we could now do is try to do a large soft selection over that approximate area, and add a bit more contrast and darken it down a little bit. And you can see if I go too far, it becomes very, very obvious. So I'm just doing the amount that I can get away with, which is basically nothing actually. And then paint perhaps a little bit more accurately there. And I'd go back and forth with this kind of method, stacking adjustments on top of one another and trying to do things as subtly as possible. But you can see you really have to apply a lot of contrast to bring out the showers to the extent of that previous edit, and that color just isn't really there. So we can get this kind of color, but only by warming up the white balance. So we can do something like this, and then you get more of a color separation and then a mass of vibrance. And I suppose you can take this wherever you want from an aesthetic standpoint. But I tend to keep myself limited to, more moderate changes when it comes to what the original scene would have looked like. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to introduce more color and contrast, but I'd love that to be there for real. So a wonderful dramatic image, but I would keep the edit a little bit more subtle, because to me, even like this is incredibly dramatic, and it just doesn't need quite that level of contrast and saturation, and I think it loses a bit of subtlety as a result. And I'm afraid the same is true of this last image. So an absolutely stunning scene, this. I assume that this is a popular scene, though I can't remember last seeing a photo of this, to be perfectly honest, but very, very pretty. I guess these are Scots pine here, particularly nicely shaped, I have to say, and even better for the reflection, which is a near perfect mirror reflection. And who can resist conditions like this as a landscape photographer? I 100% would be rolling up to take this shot myself. I would, of course, say that it's a little bit simple. It would be lovely to have a foreground to bring a bit of depth there, because this is a straight up reflection image and it's beautiful and you should absolutely take the photo. But I'd love to see a version with a foreground or some more input from the photographer to make it feel a little bit more individual. But the colors are very, very shouty. The blues at the top of the frame here in the sky are very oversaturated and almost starting to block up. I can see, I think, a little bit of a magenta cast here. So it looks a bit redder than it should do because of that magenta cast. And really all of the colors feel slightly overdone. And then we have these highlights on the water, which have been clipped to white, which I just think is a little bit too much for this image, to be honest. It almost burns my eyes. So let's just do another quick edit here, and I'm not going to remove these power lines because that is a slightly fiddly job that I don't need to waste your time with, because I'm sure many of you know how to use the spot removal tool or the clone brush or whatever's going to work best for this particular scene. So let's just start with a crop and getting this nice and level, although I suspect that isn't quite level. Let's do that again. Yeah, so I'm going to do my usual tricks here, crushing the highlights, boosting the shadows, adding some contrast, darkening the highlights a bit more to hold back that cloud that little bit more so that I can boost the exposure. And you can see here it's really quite a lot flatter and less saturated than that edit that we saw. And a bit of local work here is going to help as well. We can just try to lift these trees on the left a little bit and bring a bit more contrast through in that local area. And even add a bit of saturation, why not? and maybe a gradient over the top and bottom of the image, just to hold back that sky a little bit. Something like that. And then do that again at the bottom. And I'm trying to keep this as fast as possible. And I do apologize if you're wanting something a bit more thorough, but that isn't really the purpose of this series. And then finally set a white point and add a vignette. And again, I'm ending up with an image here that is a lot less impactful than that edit that we just saw. And I completely understand that many people will prefer that more impactful version, but to me, to be able to capture all of the subtleties of this scene is preferable to having the louder and more impactful colors. So that's where I would take the image myself, minus those power lines, of course. But I don't want to completely nullify somebody else's style, because having these colorful styles, that just appeals to a different group of people, and that's perfectly valid. So 3 lovely images, and thank you very much for sending them in, and I will see you all in the next one.